Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for the ICNC Educational Webinar Series. My name is Steve Chase and I'm the Manager of Academic Initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Today we have with us George Lakey, who's actually an old friend of mine and a longtime activist, educator, and writer. Our conversation today will focus on George's reflections on successful organizing based on his new book, How We Win, a guide to nonviolent direct action campaigning. I think people who might have seen last month's webinar, which was by Ivan Marovic, about his new book, The Path of Most Resistance, a step-by-step guide to planning a nonviolent campaign, will see this webinar as a really useful companion because it looks at somewhat the same material, but from a very different lens, and in George's case is often a storytelling lens. Today's webinar will be about an hour in length and will be in two separate portions. The first portion will be a video conversation between me and George, and that'll last about 30 minutes or so. And the final portion will be a Q&A session in which you can ask George your questions. So there's two ways during the presentation that you can ask questions. One is by clicking, one way is that you could ask to have your microphone turned on, or the telephone if you've got ready your sound on, and I would name you, I would unmute you, and you could ask your question, everybody can hear it, and then George would respond. And so to do that is, you can see the blue arrow pointing to the green hand holding up, so that's the icon you can use for that. The other way is the small button where the questions are, and you can type in a question, which I'll be able to see, and during the question and answer period, then I could ask the question that you have to George, and then he can answer it. And we'll try to get through as many of the questions as we can, and what we can't get done that we still have a record of, we'll send George those questions and get a few answers in writing, and then when we send the recording out to all the registrants for today, we'll also include the answers to the unasked questions. And so, and I can show this slide again when we get to that, but I just wanted to give people a clue about what is going to go on. And so there's various questions that you also afterwards, if you have a lingering question, there's the email address where you could say to webinar@nonviolentconflict.org, where you could send a question, which we could send on to George and explore getting an answer to. We're also live tweeting today this webinar, and you can join in. There's the hashtag that you can use when you tweet. And as I mentioned, we're recording the webinar, and then we'll send it out to everybody who has registered. And so even for people who were registered but weren't able to make it today, they can see the whole thing. You can also find ICNC on Facebook, and we have a Twitter account. So before we start the conversation with George, I just wanted to post this picture of him, both his book, his recent book, he's written 10. This is How We Win, a guide to nonviolent direct action campaigning. And there's a picture of George being arrested. He can tell you if he remembers how many times, but this was a habit of his that started in the 1960s in the civil rights movement. And while nonviolent direct action doesn't always involve civil disobedience or risking arrest, it's often a tool, and that's George doing it. I first met George when I was a teenager, about over 45 years ago, and I was inspired by Martin Luther King and the US civil rights movement. And I knew about George from a book I had found in my Quaker meeting library, actually, that he had co-authored for the civil rights movement, and it was called A Manual for Direct Action. So I jumped at the chance to hear him speak in my little hometown when he was coming through and gave a talk. And his talk that night was about how to use nonviolent civil resistance strategies to create a more just, democratic, and sustainable society. This theme is the North Star of all his work as an activist, educator, and writer. George is now an 81-year-old movement elder, and I'm proud to have him as a friend and a mentor for so many years. As I mentioned before, he's pictured here being arrested. And this, I'm pretty sure, and George can correct me, is during a successful campaign that he and others ran as a nonviolent direct action campaign to get the 7th largest bank in the United States to divest completely from its investments in mountaintop coal removal, which was harming public health in the region, had ecological consequences, and was contributing to global climate disruption. And with that same organization that he started to run that campaign, which took 5 years to win, but did, he's now an active organizer in the nonviolent campaign demanding that Philadelphia utility, power utility, powered local green jobs. And I'm sure he can talk a little more about that, or you can ask about it. So George has written 10 books. His first, as I mentioned, was called Manual for Direct Action. Most recently, he's written a book called Viking Economics, which he put out through Melville House in 2016. And it's about the positive political economic model of the Nordic countries. And his most recent book, which we'll be talking about today, is How We Win, a Guide to Nonviolent Direct Action. And that just came out towards the end of 2018. George is also a regular columnist for the online magazine Waging Nonviolence. So if people are intrigued, you don't have to limit yourself to his 10 books. He's putting out new writings regularly on Waging Nonviolence. So George, why don't we turn on our cameras and start having a conversation? Let's see.
Hi, Steve.
Right. Hi, good to see you. So many of the people here are familiar with the recent research that shows that mass movements can use nonviolent civil resistance strategies to win against apparently overwhelming odds, even military dictatorships. And in fact, empirically, have found that it's on average twice as effective as violent resistance. And this was most powerfully done in, let me even show the book, Why Civil Resistance Works, by Erica Chenoweth and Stephen. But that came out just a few years ago, and you've been involved doing strategic direct action campaigns for 6 decades now, long before this research was done. So I wanted to start today with the question that as a young working class man concerned about justice, you had choices. You could have decided to do nothing. You could have just focused on elections and lobbying, sort of normal channels things. You could have become a social worker. You could have, if you were angry enough, engage in violent political action, or you could engage in grassroots nonviolent resistance campaigns, which was the option that you chose. So what got you started thinking that this could be a serious way to make positive change and really be a powerful tool for citizens movements?
Yeah, well, it just seemed to me like common sense as a teenager. I guess I was 19 when I got involved with my first campaign, which was to stop nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere. I knew that it was a problem. It was creating cancer in children. And I also knew that the powers that were doing it, and mainly the Soviet Union and the United States, my country, were very committed to it as part of the arms race. So the idea of those other options that you suggested were indeed options, didn't strike me as options because it looked to me like the most important consideration would be that the people who were perpetrating those policies were committed to those policies. And therefore, they needed to be overwhelmed by an alternative force, that they really needed to be confronted with a big enough problem, a big enough political problem, really, so that they would have to yield. And my analysis of the electoral process of the Congress in the case of the United States was that it was pretty much following the lead of the executive branch, paying attention to the military. The military has a lot of influence and executive power, and so I thought, well, obviously, it's going to take a campaign to do this, a one-shot expression of opinion. Well, what do they care about people coming out? And doesn't really even matter how many people come out on a particular day. If they just come out and express their opinion, what the opponent understands is that then we go home at the end of the day, and that's that, and they can just continue their policy. So what it requires is repeated and escalating actions in order to win both the numbers and create the degree of problem for the opponents that needs to be created in order to win.
Thanks. Um, One of the things that I noticed in the book as I was reading How We Win is that you really stress this notion of it's not just getting together for one-off protests or sort of witnessing of public opinion about an issue, but that you really have to have sustained, repeated, and creative actions that escalate over time and build popular power and create the kind of challenge that you're talking about that's forceful enough to make change. And I know from knowing you for these many years that Gandhi was a political, that was a pattern and an example for you of seeing against enormous odds, British imperialism, and facing the challenge and how to make major change like independence when you're starting with people feeling helpless and hopeless against a powerful opponent. And you talk about sort of campaigns in the book as a model, as sort of a modality that movements are built over time by multiple campaigns. So I'd love to hear more about the lessons that you took from Gandhi about the importance of campaigns and how they can be constructed and used to really create a powerful movement that can force change, even if the opponents are not persuaded in their hearts that you're right.
Mm. I was deeply impressed by Gandhi, both by his achievement in South Africa, which was a limited reform. It didn't take care of apartheid by any means, but it was a reform uh, that was engineered by a minority group, a very small minority group, really, considering the total population. And it was done through nonviolent direct action campaigning. But then when Gandhi went back to India, his homeland, after all, and and knew how important it would be for a mass of people to stand up against the British Empire in order to change that relationship of domination, he could also see that the people were not ready to do it. He spent a year just going around doing a needs assessment, going to town after town, village after village, city after city, and he discovered that his people were feeling very much, as you say, helpless and hopeless. And so what they needed in order to believe in themselves, to even think that they could be powerful enough to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known, that they would need examples of winning. And so he chose particular local campaigns that, in his judgment, were winnable. So the peasant uprising potential in Champaran, Bardoli, the textile workers in Ahmedabad seemed to him ready, to stage a strike, which is another kind of campaign. That can have coercive impact. And so through a series of such campaigns, what he pulled off was an awakening of Indian people's understanding that they are powerful. We just don't believe it just because political scientists tell us so. And of course, in those days, political scientists were not telling us that we were the powerful ones. And so it required the power of example, first of all, to be able to mobilize people on a scale that would give the British a hard enough time so that they would finally withdraw.
Excellent. The one thing that's interesting about Gandhi is when I was actively teaching an activist training program as a master's program in Antioch University, and Gandhi's name would come up, people often had pretty erroneous ideas about him, that he was only about persuading people, and it wasn't a matter of power and sort of forcing change, even coercing, nonviolent coercion. Um, and so it took a while in engaging people to talk with him and using actual quotes from Gandhi, that it wasn't just be the change you want to see and then by example everything will come out nicely, but that he was talking about matching forces, and he didn't want to wait for
Right.
Indian independence from the British until the last British person decided, imperialism might be immoral. Um, and 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 that's where he actually made a break with, because he actually coined the term civil resistance as a way to distinguish it from sort of Western pacifists.
Mhm.
Well, we'll just be a moral example, or we'll do passive resistance. And he was not interested in that. And so I think that just for people, since you raised Gandhi, to talk a little more about, certainly there was a moral preference that he held very strongly for nonviolent resistance, but he was thinking strategically and about effectiveness and about power. And I'd like to hear your reflections and how that shows up in your book, How We Win.
Yeah, Gandhi was very explicit. At one point, I found in reading him that he called the British presence in India a deadly, serious commercial operation. Those aren't exactly the words, but that was the kind of phrase he used in order to dramatize his belief that they weren't there. Of course, they talked about having a civilizing mission and so on. And he was very contemptuous of that. He said at one point, well, if Western civilization is so great, why don't they show it by being civilized themselves? Uh, yeah, he was very, very clear that the British would have to be thrown out by the Indians, and that meant coercion, not waiting, as you say. In fact, there were some pacifists in Britain who were very slow to get on board in support of the Gandhian movement, because they felt pacifism means making nice, and that's not what Gandhi was about. And what an inspiration, because there are plenty of people that won't be convinced by our niceness, but will only be convinced because of our power, our force, the force more powerful.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's what we have to do. And that, of course, though, has strategic implications. For example, we need to understand what it is about the opponent that makes them vulnerable. So it's not, again, simply going after the opponent without examining the power situation, but actually doing an analysis. When we won against the seventh largest bank in the country, in the United States, there were friends of mine who said, oh, you can't possibly do that. You have a small group. You start in a living room and you're going to challenge the seventh largest bank. Well, we knew that there were vulnerabilities that that bank had that we could address. For one thing, it was branding itself to be a green bank, ecologically on board bank. And so we were able to disparage that by telling the truth over and over and over. For another thing, they were a customer oriented bank, which meant that they needed to keep a level of reliability and responding to their customers. So we practiced nonviolent disruption over and over and over and over in their branches and even in their headquarters. We also knew that they're required by law to have an annual shareholders meeting, and that meeting needs to be conducted in such a way that they can claim, legitimacy as a proper corporation. So we shut down two corporate meetings of theirs, two of the shareholders' meetings, again, non-violently. So we were able to discover ways that, and another point of vulnerability was that they were very aggressive about going after young people. They really wanted young people to sign up as their new customers, hoping that then they would stay customers for their lives. And so they'd go to college campuses in the first week of enrollment, and they would have their booths there saying, join us, and we're this wonderful, positive green bank, and so we would set up a booth next to theirs and challenge what they were saying and tell the truth, even if that required, on some campuses, are being pretty forceful about demanding that we had a right to tell the truth in the face of the lies that were being told by the bank. So in those various ways, we grew and grew and grew doing those actions. More and more people joined us partly because of our style, just as Gandhi adopted a style that was consistent with, or consonant with anyway, India's tradition. So also we operated in a stylistic way that would attract people who were not used to doing direct action, maybe had never done it in their lives. Many people joined us. In fact, many people who started the campaign were people who had never done a campaign before. I was kind of the old guy mentoring, and people were willing, though, to do it because we found a way of being highly disruptive and at the same time highly respectful toward the employees of the bank. And so they were spun into confusion about this. We weren't the stereotyped protesters. We also weren't the stereotyped protesters who would do their thing, go away, and do something else. We stayed on them, year after year after year, 125 different actions. And we wore them out. They realized we have no way of stopping this force, and it is too disruptive. It's too hard on our brand. We have to give in.
And in the list of tactics that you're talking about, wasn't there also pulling people out, money from the bank, not just individual customers, but large institutional customers? Did that economic non-cooperation, was that part of the vulnerabilities that you were pushing against?
Absolutely. A beautiful thing about Gene Sharp's contribution of of adding up the variety of tactics that are available to us. He came up with a number of 198. The beauty of that contribution is that whenever we seem to be working one tactic too hard, like I very much complained in my book about the tendency these days for a lot of activists to go out and block traffic as their way of claiming attention of the public. I think is usually 9 times out of 10 a big mistake to do so. But every time people do that kind of thing because they think, well, that is the thing to do, they just need to look at Gene Sharp and notice there are 198 options, and surely there's some things they haven't done yet. And surely there are things that would be more effective than doing the same old, same old. So in that way, we also challenged ourselves in our group to find the different tactics. And one, as you say, is money power. So if there's a way of getting economic non-cooperation to work for you in your campaign, do it. And we were getting people to transfer their money, and institutions to transfer their money from the bank to from the big bank that we were tackling to community banks, credit unions, that kind of thing.
Excellent. I remember when I was teaching at Antioch in the Advocacies for Social Justice and Sustainability program, that we would look at sort of the history of people's movements, largely in the United States, but some other things. But they were often surprised and interested in how various religious groups and the use of various kind of cultural forms that are just common in the culture, songs, various kinds of visual or actions being designed that were sort of creative and surprising, not the usual sort of static protest. And it seems like that in the book, you talk with many examples from history as well as your own experience in the campaigns that you were just talking about. But one of the things that I know is that you're active as a Quaker, and one of the groups that started this campaign was the Earthquaker Action Team. And part of disrupting business was having people come in and do worship in the middle of a bank branch. And, you know, and that I think broke some of the stereotypes of who normal protesters are. So I'd love to hear a little more sort of from anything from the book or the campaign experience you have of how people can build alliances with lots of different groups, including religious groups, using culture and symbols in creative ways, and making our actions more effective, more dramatic, and more powerful in that way. Um,
Oh, there's so many examples. There's so many examples. As you say, um, the practice of actual worship in bank lobbies was startling in the beginning. The bank branch managers would be on the phone with headquarters. What do we do with these people? They've circled up in the lobby and they've sat down and they're singing and they're worshiping, and what's going on, and how do I handle this? And it created a dilemma. One of the formulations that I invented long ago and that is now spread quite widely is the dilemma demonstration. In the dilemma demonstration, we find a tactic that puts the opponent in a place where if they do one thing, it's not great for them, but if they do the other thing, it's not great for them. And in the case of the bank lobby worship style that we would do, one thing they could do is arrest us, but arresting people for worshiping, well, that's questionable. And on the other hand, leaving us do that was actually highly disruptive of the operations of the bank. And so we over and over put people in that kind of dilemma. This can be done in so many different situations. I'm remembering, for example, the workers in Paris who decided to go on strike by stopping the underground, the metro. But on the other hand, they thought if we just go on strike, on a regular strike, that inconveniences massively the huge number of people who need to go to work. So what if we go ahead and run the trains, but simply refuse to accept the payment for the trains? So you can imagine the crisis that created for the authority that they were striking against, because the trains were running, but there was no income. And the strike was settled remarkably quickly as a result. There's so much room for creativity, Steve. And I must admit, that's part of what attracted me to nonviolent direct action campaigns in the first place, realizing that each campaign offers its own possibilities for creativity, but also the culture that surrounds us and our connections that we can make with artists, with musicians, with creative people, with, especially since we're very much about creating drama. Let's, who are the theater people we know? We don't know them yet. Make friends with actors and directors, and discover the possibilities of doing drama in a highly creative way that sends the message that we want to send and surprises the opponent.
hmm. That's excellent. One of the things, because we're sort of running out of time for just you and me chatting, and we're going to be opening it up soon to questions from other people. But before we do that, in your book, you're talking mainly about how to identify an issue, identify the target, the institution or the decision makers that could make a difference on this. What are their vulnerabilities? How to plan a strategy that builds over time with repeated actions, and it's sort of classical good campaign organizing. But towards the end of the book, you're also talking about how campaigns can coalesce over time, local campaigns, and build movements that include sub-movements and various campaigns. And you even use the phrase talking about a movement of movements. And so I think it would be good just to people to hear that that your book deals with a lot of the nuts and bolts of how to win very specific campaigns, but you're also taking some time to think about What are the historical examples? And you've already talked about Gandhi's independence struggle. There was campaign after campaign after campaign before they finally kicked the British out. But how in the present day do you see the role of campaigns adding up over time into something larger that can make fundamental shifts for greater democracy, justice, and sustainability?
Well, a campaign that is on the road to winning tends to spur other campaigns around the same thing. So, for example, with regard to the environmentalist protests against pipelines, fossil fuel pipelines, there have been sufficient number of wins. So there are many, many pipeline campaigns in this country and other countries and so on. So so it's a very natural outgrowth of successful campaigns or unsuccessful campaigns that are sufficiently dramatic that they call attention to themselves to spur and stimulate other campaigns and in that way create a movement. Okay, so great. That also, though, tends to stimulate in any given society other people with other grievances or other problems that they're trying to solve, and they're likely to start campaigns addressing theirs. And that has happened over and over in the historic context where people next door, so to speak, in that society see, well, they're getting something on their issue. Why don't we use nonviolent direct action to win something on our issue? And so there's a second movement that gets created when there are multiple campaigns grow, and then another movement and another movement. So once you get a bunch of movements going, there's always the question, well, what if we were to join these movements and create a movement of movements? What are the advantages of that? There's always a disadvantage to everything, and so the disadvantages need to be looked at as well. Well, if in a particular country, it turns out that there are multiple movements that are getting a no for their demands from the same power structure, as in, for example, the United States, there are multiple movements where there's veto power that has been taken by the economic elite saying no, 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 no to this, no to that, no to the other thing, no to gun control, no to higher wages, no to environmental sanity, and so on. So when you've got the same opponent and a number of movements all being stopped by the same opponent or being held back by the same opponent, then there's a lot of reason for those movements to join and together to be able to push aside that opponent that is blocking them in many ways. That is, though, tricky. That is very, very tricky because there's an inevitable competitiveness that happens among movements. There's often a tendency for a movement leadership to say, no, we're more important than that other movement. Move over and let us just do this thing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's almost like real life is messy.
Exactly, messy, including ego-led leaders who want to do performance. And so you've got all that mess. And one of the things that this book contributes in an unusual way, I think, is that it shows how building particular kinds of campaigns help to build healthy movements that are more likely to be able to merge, be able to at least create a coalition such that they can then get the job done. And so I believe bottom up, let's create powerful campaigns that are really healthy and know how to build healthy movements, which in turn know how to build coalitions of movements, a movement of movements, which can then get the job done for multiple people. And one of the secret ingredients of that is, or secret in some societies, in mine, is the ingredient called a vision of what it is that once we push the opponent aside will be possible for us to create, which means a positivity that enters the process. And campaigners that have a positive vision of what they want, Gandhi knew this very well. When people have a positive vision of what they want, they will struggle much harder than just in reaction. Because when you're only reacting against something that you don't like, you're way more prone for burnout. And burnout's a problem. People that I started in the movement with, I don't see there's something, they burn out. I'm 81 and ready to go because I have always emphasized a positive vision of what it is I want. And that keeps me moving forward.
Excellent. Before we open it up to questions, you've talked a lot about examples, and you use them in the book. And it's clear that you believe that people can learn a lot from paying attention to what other people have done in difficult situations and what kind of creativity they brought with them. And one of the projects that you've done that's beyond the book that I just wanted to let people know about, and I think it's visible now. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
About the database that you developed at Swarthmore College, the Global Nonviolent Direct Action Base, or the Nonviolent Action Base database? Is that visible, George?
Yes, it is visible. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you want to just say something quick, and then we'll open it up to other folks for their questions?
Well, it has the 198, and actually we found a method of nonviolent direct action that Gene Sharp had not identified. So our database includes 199, and people can search for that. People can search if they're curious about, well, what if we were to do, let's say, a hunger strike? What might that be like? You can simply go on this database and search for hunger strikes. You will see a variety of campaigns around the world that have used a hunger strike, and you can learn from their experience. We have campaigns in this database from almost 200 countries and from multiple decades, in some cases, multiple decades and even centuries. We go back to the 10th century BC. So we've got an extraordinary number of campaigns here that people can just feast on, and it's as close as the internet.
Great. I'm going to look for questions and just remind people again, they can press the little green hand, and that'll let me know that you want to speak and ask a question directly. And some people are already writing some questions in the question box, the two ways we can do that. So I'm going to start with a written question. The strategy of civil resistance can be adopted effectively by those whose values and ideas are very different from ours. At times, our opponents are able to appeal and mobilize values that are directly opposed to ours. I'm thinking specifically about climate action. Large numbers of people mobilize at times to maintain the status quo and not necessarily support the changes, especially in, say, coal mining regions where the questioner lives. And their rallies are sometimes bigger and more energized than ours. As a strategist, how do you deal with this situation that multiple groups with competing interests could be using nonviolent direct action as a tool?
I learned a lot from Gandhi with regard to this because he believed that there is, no matter how passionate we are on behalf of our cause, it's not actually the truth that we have the absolute truth, that there is more to be learned. And he thought there was such a thing as absolute truth philosophically. It's just that he thought human beings wouldn't get to know what it was. And therefore, each time we struggle, we're struggling on behalf of our point of view, which may have some flaws, which is guaranteed not to be the complete truth. So his pro-conflict philosophy was that people should be in conflict with each other. It could be as civilized as an Oxford University debate, or it could be as contentious as coal miners out there doing nonviolent direct action tactics to block others who are trying to close down a mine. And that is just fine from Gandhi's point of view and from my point of view. From may the best one win. And the point of the nonviolent discipline is to ensure that nobody's getting killed over these questions of who's right, who's wrong, but that people are getting a chance to marshal their evidence. They actually can engage in negotiation and dialogue in the course of the increasingly heated conflict, and also they can escalate their nonviolence too in order to show how passionately they care about this. So a clear example for the 1931 Salt Satyagraha was when the British troops, whose job it was to enforce order, of course, um, had gotten tired of trying to get rid of marches and disperse them and prevent the Gandhian independence people from continuing to march. So at one point, they came out onto the street down which was coming a huge mass of Indians for independence, and the troops sat and nonviolently blockaded the street, which meant that the Indians would need to, walk over the soldiers, nonviolent resistance, in order to be able to proceed in their march. So it was nonviolence versus nonviolence. So what happened was that the Indians, as the stalemate continued and continued and continued, realized night is coming, it's going to get cold, there's predictions of rain. So their supporters were out collecting blankets and ponchos and food and so on and so on. And when a lot of that had been handed over to the people, the marchers in the streets, the Indian marchers, handed a lot of it over to the soldiers. That was more than the soldiers could handle. The commanders realized morale broke, and so they called the soldiers aside, and the marchers proceeded to victory. So that's the kind of escalation that nonviolent civil resistance encourages. It's not that we don't disagree with each other, even nonviolent folks contending with nonviolent folks. It's that we can disagree and we can also escalate. But look how different nonviolent escalation looks from violent escalation.
Yeah. I'm also thinking in relationship to this particular question of what you were saying about coalition building. Now, it could be in a case where people are working on climate justice, that they're not thinking deeply enough about the needs of certain sectors of the working population, and they haven't created a vision that includes green jobs and transitions and adequate income to people. And so part of that is that different people using these same tactics is that we can learn from each other and maybe figure out ways. Is there some common ground? Is there something that my movement is missing that's causing this counteraction, not from the state or from corporations, but from other segments of the population? And are there just any examples that you can think of where a movement has sort of expanded the circle of who it's involved with once it gets some pushback from some people who are going, I'm not sure about this because it doesn't seem you're paying attention to key needs that I have?
Well, the current campaign, once we won the bank campaign, the current campaign of Earthquaker Action Team is exactly of the kind you're describing. Because once we realized, okay, now we can design a new campaign. What should we go after? We realized that the first campaign we did not include as broad a coalition as it needed to. It didn't include the tremendously neglected Black population, Black working class population, which is a population that experiences a lot of joblessness. And so we designed the new campaign, we call it Power Local Green Jobs, to make a demand on our electrical utility to solarize in order to get their energy instead of to continue in fossil fuels, to solarize and to hire the people in low-income areas to solarize the rooftops that are in those low-income areas, and therefore put people to work build wealth in those poverty-stricken areas, and in that way, create a win-win. So that would be an example. It is important, as Gandhi said, that we learn from our opponent, and also learn from the people who are showing their the lack of resonance that our version of the truth has by not participating. And
Hmm.
so by by deliberately designing our new campaign to be one that would be involving and advance the interests of Black working class people, we now find ourselves in a cross-class campaign that, yes, retains the climate change concern, but also welcomes the concern for jobs.
Excellent. And we will send out a video about that campaign when we send out the recording of this webinar to people, because I think it's pretty interesting. We have another question here. Actually, it's populating with questions. We're clearly not going to get to all of them, but let's do some. Here is a question from a woman who's asking, how do you view the damage of property as a nonviolent tactic? Are there times that it could be strategically used, and is there times that it's a disadvantage strategically?
We had that as a big issue when we designed the database, because it's not all that unusual that a nonviolent campaign does include some property destruction. And so we decided we wouldn't call property destruction violent. We would, allow for it, as Gene Sharp, in fact, did as well, by defining violence as injury to people. Now, there is some property that is so invested with human personality. I'm thinking about a painter finishing a painting. It's an amazing canvas. They've worked on it for a year and a half, and it's finally done. And you walk in there and slash it to pieces, and that is injury to a person. Right? So there's always, in every definition, is an age-old problem about definition. There's always gray areas. But in general, we found that emphasizing injury to humans was a way of trying to allow for the possibility of property destruction being a tactic that could be, considered perhaps sensible. The question, though, is it sensible? That is to say, does it pass the strategy test? Will it really advance the campaign? And that depends on a welter of things, including the cultural way of looking at property destruction. There can be cultures in which property destruction is looked at as violent. That is, it is perceived as violent. In fact, there are cultures where property destruction is considered more violent than hurting people. Right? And so, if we are trying to present ourselves as a nonviolent movement, which has all kinds of advantages, which I go into in the book, if we're presenting ourselves as a nonviolent movement and operating in a culture in which property destruction is considered violent, then we'll want to steer clear of property destruction because it's walking into a trap. So there are a lot of considerations about that. I think a lot of considerations. I always think many times before approving of a particular use of property destruction.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from a woman who's wanting you to talk a bit more about the combining of an attitude of respect when you're, I think it's in relationship to going into bank branches, but disrupting the operations of the institution while still showing respect for the people who work there. So just asking for a little more clarity of how you combine the disruption, the contention, with respect for the people involved.
We found it enormously helpful, and we include this in the book. So the book is lessons from 100 years ago and lessons from 5 years ago. So a lesson from 5 years ago is that demonstrations go way, way better when there are appointed roles ahead of time and trained people perform these roles. So there's a role of police liaison, for example. There's a role of mass media relations and so on. So one of the roles that we have is relating to the people in, say, in the bank campaign, the employees in the bank, and particularly the bank manager. So when we would go into a bank, somebody would make a beeline for the bank manager and explain what we're here, what we're not going to do, what we are going to do, and so on and so on. Uh, and and sometimes there would be somebody additional to relate to the security guards as a separate category. Sometimes even somebody assigned to talk to the tellers about it, the bank tellers at the windows. And so, so the main body of the action is going ahead while we know that there are people being reached out to, so that they don't misunderstand. Because in a situation that's frightening, it's easy for people to, be to be alarmed when there's really no need for them to be alarmed.
Excellent, thanks. We have another woman who's asking an interesting question, sort of about the words you've used, but the title of your book, How We Win. And she's asking, what does it mean to win in civil resistance or nonviolent resistance? Why are you putting sort of victory and winning as such a central theme, and what do you mean by it?
Right. Oh, so much went into that. One, just a definitional question. A campaign wins when it achieves the goal it sets out to achieve. So our goal was to get the largest financier of mountaintop removal coal mining out of that business, and we succeeded. We succeeded so well that within a week, Barclays Bank in the United Kingdom, the 800-pound gorilla of the British Commonwealth in banking world, it also withdrew from investing in mountaintop removal coal mining. So that's a big win. We call it a win for a variety of reasons. My favorite reason for calling it a win, rather than a win-win or something, is that is not usually experienced by the opponent as a win. It's experienced by the opponent as a frustration, or we're really upset because we love that profit stream that's coming in through blowing up banks and doubling the cancer rates in the area. We love that money. So it is in that sense a win. But I'd also like it because it contrasts with a kind of witness orientation that some people have, that our job is not to change something, but is simply to express an opinion about it, is to take that moral stand and go down in history as having been on the right side of this or that. And it's not that I don't care about ethics. I've taught in a theological seminary and I got along great with the ethics professor. I, of course, am myself hugely motivated by ethics. And I'm a practical working class guy who wants to get stuff done. And too often, the worry about win-lose has been used as an excuse for people to be just plain ineffective and not to actually change things that desperately need changing.
I remember once when I read your book, Strategy for a Living Revolution, and this was back in the 70s, and I was rather startled by a comment you made that most pacifists don't engage in civil resistance, and most people who do engage in civil resistance aren't pacifists. That, there's certainly people can have an ethical preference for this mode of struggle versus other way, but the effectiveness matters, and that's what seems to attract and create mass movements. And Gandhi had strong personal feelings, but he always talked about that he was encouraging people who would accept nonviolent resistance as the policy for this particular campaign for its effectiveness. And so I think that's interesting. And I was actually excited when you said how we win in the book. Now, I think we have a little more time, so there looks like somebody who actually wanted to get on the mic and ask a question. And so I'm going to open up the mic for you, Dennis, if you're there. Let me just unmute you. Oh, I'm having trouble doing that. Oh, I'm so sorry. For some reason, that's not working. So I'll go to another question. Oh, here's a controversial one. Somebody asked about do you have a particular view of what's going on in Venezuela?
I haven't followed it closely enough to have a considered opinion. I think it's, it's obviously a tremendous. Oh, it might be about this moment. It might be about this moment rather than a historical analysis, right? Oh, well, if it's about this moment, then we have an example of the claimant to the leadership of the country using nonviolent struggle in order to succeed. And so this, for example, this move of asking for humanitarian assistance to be gathered at the border, and then leaning on the army to allow it to go through, because the army is working class people with families who are in need themselves, extended families anyway, is putting nonviolent pressure uh, uh, on on one of the pillars of the dictatorship, in order to get a change to happen. So we are seeing nonviolent action, I think, playing out in that person's campaign. The army has been a major prop for the dictatorship and is on the take on the commanding officers level, in order, that's part of the power structure. So I think it's a brilliant move so far, the way it's being unfolded. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know it's causing a lot of debate about for a lot of people. It's interesting to hear your thoughts about how that goes. Well, we're almost done. So I just have a quick practical question that a woman has asked, which is, are you still collecting examples for the database that you talked about? So how is that getting added to? Um, and if somebody is thinking about a case study, is there any way to have that submitted and be considered for the database?
New cases are welcomed with great enthusiasm. Yes, there are over 1,100 cases in there so far. There is, as we speak, another research seminar going on at Swarthmore College of avid Swarthmore students who are compiling more cases, and they will be entered in the database. Those students love to get suggestions of new cases. So please send your suggestion to Lee Smithy. He's the professor who's taken over managing the database after I retired. Lee
Why
Smithy.
don't I
And
put in his email when I send the mailing out with the recorded webinar and some additional resources? I'll give a
thank
link to the database and also list Lee. So,
Great.
so that's good. So at this point, you're not asking people from around the world to be writing up case studies, but they can contact Lee, offer material that then would be used by Swarthmore students to refine it into acceptance into the database.
Exactly, because we want the cases to be comparable in terms of the research methodology and definitions. And that's why it needs to go through those trained researchers in order to enter the database. Yeah.
Great. Well, we've got like maybe one more minute. So I thought I would just pose this question of, you talked about burnout, and a couple people here in their questions have referred to that. And as an 81-year-old, still very dynamic and active movement elder, um, what are the top one or two or three quick ways that you've um, found to stay engaged and vital and feeling like you're making a difference? How do you avoid burnout? And then we'll
The
close
two
up.
biggest, I mean, there are so many, but there are two biggest for me. Number one, I made friends long ago with my emotional states and do express them. I express them at appropriate times for the most part, rather than, screaming at the bank, at the bank tellers. So I go home and scream. I already referred to Martin Luther King having pillow fights at the end of a tense day. I'm a great believer in. I often cry over the morning newspaper, actually. I like to eat my cereal while reading the newspaper, and I find myself frequently in tears because there is so much to grieve about what's going on. So be friends. That's what works for me. I'm very friendly with my emotions, and I allow them to come forward and be expressed. And that's a terrific way of de-stressing. And then the second biggest thing is the support group. Having a supportive group of comrades, a supportive group of people to be with that can listen to each other, that can sympathize with each other, empathize with each other, and really be there. And another advantage of a campaign is that can be the spot, as Earthquaker Action Team is for me, can be a spot of 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 caring and thoughtful people who look out for each other, have each other's backs while we undergo the stress of a nonviolent direct action campaign.
Thank you so much, George, for this hour together. And I really appreciate all the people who have participated in this. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. I will send some questions that haven't been answered to George, and we'll try to get answers to as many as we can out to you in the email that I've mentioned.
Steve, can I
So
mention also that there's a comment section for each of my articles on waging nonviolence, and people often will address questions to me that I respond to in that way. The comment section for wagingnonviolence.org.
okay, let me see. I think I actually have,
There we
no.
go.
Oh, did I have it?
Yes, you had
Okay.
it. There we go.
So there we go. This is the page that you can look up on Waging Nonviolence online. George is a columnist, and you can look at his columns and post questions and comment on them here. So anyway, again, thank you all for joining this ICNC educational webinar. George, thank you so much for taking the time, and we will see you all later.